So a very warm welcome everybody, very warm welcome to you. Happy New Year, and especially a warm welcome if this is your first time on these Tuesday Sangha Nights. But also a warm welcome to everybody. So we're sort of re-kicking off these Tuesday Sangha Nights for the new year. So it's time for a bit of a recap, partly because it would be really good to recap for those people who are joining this class for the first time, just to sort of give you a bit of an overview of what we have been doing, what we are doing. So we normally take a year-long theme with these Tuesday night Sangha Nights. We use that as a structure for exploring the Dharma and the way we can put it into practice in our life. And since September, we've been exploring the Dharma through stories and symbols, and seeing what that can tell us about the Dharma and what it can tell us about how we practice. And we'll be carrying that theme on through the rest of the year. But we've also got a sort of sub-theme within that. So since September, we've been looking at what's called the system of practice of the Triratna Buddhist community. It's a formulation that allows us to see some of the different aspects that we're getting at in meditation and in our practice in general. And we've been using that as our sort of sub-theme. So we've been looking at we've been looking at this and how using symbols and stories. So it's slightly sort of complicated, nested structure of themes here. So this system of practice that we've been looking at. Integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth and receptivity. Sometimes also called the stages of the spiritual path. But that sort of gives the impression that you always do one after the other. You get one out of the way and then you move on to the other. And it's not really like that, actually. It's much more that these are different things that we need to be working on. And we may be mainly concerned with one at any particular time. It's not as though we just do one at a time and then move on. So we started out the year in September, with a sort of term structure, looking at integration. And this word integration was a word that I think was originally used in this sense by psychotherapists like C.G. Jung, using it to describe the process by which we move from being a sort of bundle of uncoordinated, conflicting motivations and sort of parts of ourselves to being a united, harmonious human being. So we don't start out life as a unified being whose energies and desires are all running in the same direction. It's a bit more as though we're a bundle of people, sort of rather loosely tied together with a name and a past history, sharing a body that we sometimes pull in different directions. So we might be a different person according to who we're with. We might be a different person with that group of friends and with that group of friends. Different person with our parents, different person with at work, etc., etc. And we're also different people just at different times. So one day we make a resolution. I am definitely going to go running 3 miles every day. Right? Definitely going to never eat another biscuit. I'm going to meditate every morning. And we mean it. We really, really mean it. We think there's no way I'm going back on this. Then 2 days later, it's as though we're a different person. Oh, well, I don't really care about that. I'd much rather do something else. It really is as though there's a different person there who doesn't think that's a good idea anymore. That's why most New Year's resolutions don't get kept, actually, because we're not integrated. And we make a resolution with one part of ourselves, fully believing that we're carrying out, absolutely knowing that it's a good idea. But then a bit later, it's as though we're somebody else who lives by a completely different set of principles. And also our energies aren't united. It's not as though they all run in the same direction and serve the same purpose. We've probably got lots of conflicting ideas about what we should be doing with our life, how we should be living. And sometimes we decide to do this, sometimes we decide to do that. Sometimes we can't decide which to do, and we spend our time sort of oscillating in anxiety. And also we're not in touch with the whole of ourselves. It's as though we've got heights and depths and resources that we're not always aware of. And to be really full, whole, potent individuals, with a fulfilling life, we need to integrate those as well. We need to have our deep energies and our deep volitions working for us on our side rather than undermining us. I mean, perhaps even quite coarse energies like our aggression and so on, working for us rather than undermining us. And crucially, we need to be in touch with having a sense of higher purpose, a sense of meaning that comes from being in touch with our heights. We need the guidance, if you like, of what we might call our higher self that we're often out of touch with. So, integration along with positive emotion is very much the starting point of the spiritual life. We need to build a healthy, harmonious self as a starting point. It's only then that we can think in terms of transcending ourselves. And integration is also the key to becoming a potent, powerful individual who can make their own decisions and stick to them, who can carry through with commitments, who can really make things happen in the world rather than having things done to us. That comes from being a unified, integrated individual. So integration is the starting point, where it's an essential aspect of the spiritual life, becoming a whole, harmonious human being rather than being fractured and fragmented and having different selves pulling in different directions. So we spent a couple of months earlier last year, looking at stories and symbols that tell us something about how we can speed up this process of integration, how we can make progress away from being full of internal conflict and anxiety towards being more powerful, effective, harmonious individuals. And since then we've been looking at positive emotion. So this is also an essential starting point for any sort of spiritual progress, positive emotion. We could know all about all sorts of abstruse philosophy, all sorts of abstruse Buddhist philosophy. We could have all sorts of what we might think are inside experiences in meditation. We could keep strictly to all sorts of really detailed ethical rules. But if we don't feel like emotions like metta and compassion and joy, if our relationships with other people and the world around us aren't transformed, none of that is worth anything. None of that's worth anything. If it's just in our heads, it's a smokescreen. Spiritual growth has to involve all of us. It's got to involve our hearts. It's got to involve our guts, our whole body. It's only real if it changes all of us, our whole being. Not if it's limited to the top 3 inches of our head, or perhaps 2 inches of our head. What we call our emotions are who we are. We feel them in our whole body. They determine how we think. They determine how we see the world. So we need to cultivate positive emotion. We need to cultivate as much positive emotion as we can at the very start. As soon as we start sort of trying to follow a spiritual path. And we need to cultivate as much positive emotion as we can, no matter how far we think we've got. It's not a need that goes away. Positive emotion is something we need at every stage. And it's part and parcel of all the later stages. It's part and parcel of what we're calling spiritual death and spiritual rebirth. I'll just say something very briefly about them. Spiritual death sounds a bit daunting. But what this basically means is change. Spiritual death, spiritual rebirth. It means letting go of our sort of fixed idea of ourselves. Letting go of old past limiting selves. Also, even letting go of our whole idea of ourselves as a separate, isolated individual. And becoming something more. Stepping into some bigger shoes. Becoming somebody who is not limited by our ideas of our past self. But it can be much more. And all of these require this last one, receptivity. So that's just a little bit about this whole scheme. So, coming back to positive emotion, as I've said, it's completely essential to spiritual progress. But hey, forget about spiritual progress, forget about enlightenment. It's essential to being happy. No positive emotion, no happiness. Why wouldn't we want it? Whether we think of ourselves as spiritual or not, why wouldn't we want it? If there's such a thing as happiness, then positive emotions are what it is. Okay, maybe not all emotions that we can think of as positive are always pleasant. I mean, it might not be pleasant to feel compassion, to actually be aware of somebody else's suffering. But without positive emotion, we are stuck in a cramped, tight, smelly prison of really limited concern for our own little selves. Which in the long run is guaranteed, it's the grade A guaranteed way to be very, very unhappy. I'll tell a story tonight which I think illustrates that. Emotions like metta and gratitude connect us to other people and they connect us to the world around us. They lead to richness in our life, they lead to joy. Cultivating metta and gratitude, I don't know what the adverts say, cultivating metta and gratitude is a far more effective way of making ourselves happier than getting the latest gadget or having a bigger car or a bigger house or some new clothes. It's more effective than an expensive holiday. We can go on an expensive holiday and be thoroughly miserable. If we're just focused on ourselves and our own wants and our own resentments, we'll fall out with the people we're with. I used to live in Spain near some Spanish resorts, and you'd frequently see couples, they'd gone on their holiday, they'd spent their savings, and what were they doing? They were really cheesed off with each other because they wanted to do different things. They were having a thoroughly miserable time. At the time, we were living up a mountain with, no mod cons whatsoever, doing a lot of meditation and work, and we were pretty happy actually. And you go down and see these people supposed to be having a good time, but because they were focused on me and my good time, they were completely miserable. They were probably much happier back home actually. So much more effective in terms of just ordinary worldly happiness than an expensive holiday, for example. You can be very happy, you can be very unhappy on a very expensive holiday, you can be very happy, even in Sheffield, even in January, if you've got metta and appreciation and positive relationships with other people. So why wouldn't we want to cultivate it? You don't have to even think in terms of enlightenment or spiritual progress. Why wouldn't we want it? So, yeah, as I said, it's the key to happiness. And I'm going to tell a story from our culture, actually. Which I think, which is very related to this time of year, the time of year that's just gone past, and I think sort of illustrates some really important things about the cultivation of positive emotion and how transformative it can be, and how it can in fact lead to spiritual death and spiritual rebirth, to becoming a new person, a completely new and shiny, bright person, rather than the old sort of rather grubby one. And this is a Charles Dickens story called A Christmas Carol. Okay, and you're probably going, oh, no, it's, okay. Okay, it's a bit sentimental at times. It sort of veers slightly in that direction. And okay, it glorifies Christmas, which maybe we don't want to do particularly, which in our time has become a sort of tacky consumerist extravaganza. Maybe bar humbug is perfectly appropriate response to what Christmas has become. Nevertheless, it's a very wise story, actually, that tells us a lot. And our story starts by introducing us to one Ebenezer Scrooge. So Scrooge is so famous, his name has entered our language and our culture as a sort of archetype of something. Dickens describes him as squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous, hard as flint from which no steel has ever struck generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shrivelled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, made his thin lips blue, and made him speak out shrewdly in his grating voice. He carried his own low temperature around with him always. He froze his office in the dog days of summer, and he didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. So Scrooge is the very antithesis of warm emotions. He's cold. Cold is the big metaphor that Dickens uses for Scrooge. He even looks like he's cold. And he's trapped in himself. He's trapped in himself. He's self-contained and solitary as an oyster, is what Dickens said. He's the opposite of connected. He's trapped. He's trapped in his own concerns, his own ego, his own concern for himself. He's the opposite of connected, and he says some people come around collecting for the poor at Christmas, and he tells them it is enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. So I keep myself to myself. He's opposite of connected. He's trapped, he's cut off from others. So Dickens tells us, nobody ever stopped him on the street to say with a glad face, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come round to see me?" But what did Scrooge care? He edged his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. So, one of the things about Scrooge is he thinks he's cleverer than everybody else. He, on at least one occasion in the story, he says he's surrounded by fools. He thinks everybody's a fool, except him. And he's materialistic, and he's rational, and he's cynical. He only values what can be seen and measured. So when his nephew wishes him a Merry Christmas, he famously replies, "Bah, humbug." And he goes on to say, "Merry Christmas, what reason have you got to be merry? You're poor enough." But actually his nephew is more than a match for him. So he says, "Merry Christmas, what reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." And his nephew says, "What reason have you to be dismal then? You're rich enough." So to me, Scrooge seems very in keeping with the spirit of our age. The message we're bombarded with in the media is that the way to be happy is to be rich. You know, what reason have you got to be merry or poor? So we have to sacrifice everything for economic growth. Economic growth, having more money and more stuff, is the key to human happiness. But we don't seem to have noticed that, like Scrooge, we're already rich enough. So why are we so dismal? Like Scrooge, so many people live unfulfilled lives that are dismal. Also like Scrooge. So although it's Christmas Eve, and in the mindset of Dickens, that should mean it's the season of goodwill to all people, Scrooge is thoroughly nasty. He's nasty to his nephew. His nephew comes and asks him round for Christmas dinner, and he says, "Bah, humbug, what reason have you to be merry?" And he refuses his invitation to Christmas dinner. And he's thoroughly nasty to some charity collectors collecting money for the poor who come round. He says to them, they're saying about the poor at Christmas, he said, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? And if they die, well, if some of them do die, well, that will reduce the excess population." So he's sort of, he's all reason and no human empathy, no positive emotion. And finally, he's thoroughly nasty to his poor put-upon clerk, Bob Cratchit, who he really doesn't want to give Christmas Day off to, because he's not going to get the work done. So, it's Christmas Eve, he locks up the office, poor old Bob Cratchit goes home, and then as a very cold and frosty and gloomy and foggy night falls, Scrooge makes his way home through the gathering gloom. And it's just about dark as he gets home to this big door of his house, and he can't hardly see anything. It's very gloomy and it's very foggy. and he reaches out for his doorknob, but instead of his usual doorknob, he sees the head of his long dead business partner. I was going to say Bob Marley. Jacob Marley. Jacob Marley, who's been dead these past 6 years. He sees Jacob Marley's head, who's been dead this past 6 years. So he recalls in shock and horror. But then he reminds himself that he's a rationalist. He doesn't believe in this sort of rubbish. He probably says bar humbug to himself. He collects himself together and he opens the door. None of this is real. And then he double locks the door, thinking like the good materialist that he is, that this will keep out whatever it is that's threatening him. Trouble is, it's in his own mind what's threatening him. So when he gets into the hallway of his big, empty, dark, gloomy house, he thinks he sees a hearse with a coffin going up the very wide stairs. And then when he gets into his dark, gloomy living room, he sees his ornate fireplace, which is carved with loads and loads of different figures. He thinks that each figure has got the head of his dead partner, Jacob Marley. And then a bell starts to toll. And then he hears the clanking of chains, as though somebody's dragging chains across the floor. And Jacob Marley's ghost appears before him, wreathed about with chains and dragging his chains across the floor, looking very, very miserable. So, all this stuff about death, hearses and dead people, and the appearance of a ghost, we could say is the eruption of some sort of knowledge of reality into Scrooge's mind. Impermanence is a fact. We will die, like Bob Marley. Scrooge is going to die. That's reality. But Scrooge still tries to protect himself with his old defence of cynical scepticism. He even tries to make a joke of it. So this ghost appears to him. And the ghost says, "Do you believe in me?" And he says, "Well, no, not really." He said, things like you, they could come about as a result of a bad dinner. And he even tries to make a joke about it. He says, it could be the result of a bad dinner. In fact, you smell more of gravy than the grave. Which, for Scrooge, actually, is quite clever. But Jacob Marley's ghost is not to be put off. And he tells Scrooge that he himself, Jacob Marley, because of his self-centred life, in which he didn't care about anyone but himself, because of that, he's doomed to wander in chains. He says the chains are of his own making. He made them link by the way he lived, and now he has to drag them around. He says, "I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it." And he says to Scrooge, "Would you like to know the weight and the length and the strength of the chain you've got around you? When I died 6 years ago, it was just as heavy as mine, and you've been making it more and more ever since. It's a ponderous chain." And he tells Scrooge, so he says, "I made this because all I cared about was business, when my real business was the welfare of people." And he tells Scrooge that he's come to warn him. He says that Scrooge has spent all this time making this terrible chain for himself, far more terrible than Jacob Marley's. And he warns him that unless he changes his life, he will face the same horrible fate, doomed to wander around carting this chain with a whole load of other ghosts. He describes other ghosts as sort of carting big heavy safes around and all sorts of other things that they've created in their life. He'll be forever doomed to wandering around with his chains, and forever doomed to regret for having wasted the opportunity to do something positive with the years that he had. So Jacob Marley's ghost shows Scrooge the reality of impermanence and death, which he would rather forget about. He shows him the reality of the law of karma. You make a chain by your own actions, by the way you live. Yeah, you can do. And he points out that he's got a precious opportunity and that he will regret it forever if he wastes it. So those of you who have come across the four reminders, speaking to those who have been around a bit longer, those of you who have come across the four reminders will recognise three of them there. Jacob Marley's ghost thrusts three of the four traditional reminders that Buddhists meditate on into Scrooge's face. The reality of impermanence and death, the fact that this human life is a precious one-off opportunity, and the scary reality of the law of karma. The fact that we really can, unless we're careful, make chains for ourselves by the way we act and live. So out of concern for his old partner, Jacob Marley's ghost gives him this terrible warning, gives Scrooge this terrible warning. He tells him he must change. And he says he will see three more spirits that might bring that change about. But completely in character for someone who is all about reason and out of touch with his emotions, Scrooge says, well, you've already mourned me. What do I need the three spirits for? You know, I now know what you're saying. Can't I do without them? I know with my head what you're telling me, and that's enough. But Jacob Marley's ghost tells him it doesn't work like that. There won't be any real change unless he experiences the emotions that the three spirits will lead him to experience. He might know he needs to change, but the three spirits that are to come will cause the emotional change that he needs. He needs to be moved in his whole being, and it's not just enough to know. And that's what the ghosts are going to do. So Scrooge, ever the rationalist, says, well, three's the one. Can't we just do them all at once? It sort of doesn't take on board that there's a process of emotional change that needs to happen here. You can't just get it over with. Anyway, so Jacob Marley's ghost tells him you're going to get three spirit visitations. And if you're lucky, that'll get you out of the mess you're in. And sure enough, in the course of the night, three different ghosts appear to Scrooge as he tries to get some sleep in his dark, gloomy, big, lonely, rather scary house. And the first ghost appears at 1 a.m, and it's the ghost of Christmas past. The ghost it's a funny beast because it sort of describes it as giving off light. It's giving off light, but it's got a candle snuffer on its head. It's a very weird ghost. And Scrooge is constantly trying to snuff it out. It brings light, the light of awareness, but Scrooge doesn't want it. He doesn't want to see it. He resists. He's anything but receptive. The light of awareness, is not something he wants. But in the end, the ghost sort of overpowers him in a way and takes him on a journey against his will. And he sort of takes him and he flies with Scrooge out of the house, into the sky, over London, over the surrounding countryside. Until eventually Scrooge starts to recognise the landscape. He starts to recognise the landscape from his childhood. He starts to recognise places. And then he's taken to, it sounds like a school that he was in, where he was sort of left over the holidays because he was a bit neglected by his parents. And there he's shown himself as a miserable young boy, poor and lonely and neglected. So he sees himself poor and lonely and neglected as a young child, reading a book and very lost in the fantasy world that the books open up for him. And he feels compassion for his younger, suffering self. And this immediately turns into compassion for other children, like the boy he used to be. And he gets this uprush of regret, because just a short while ago, a young child, just like the child that he was, had come to his door asking for food, and he turned him away. And he gets this uprush of regret about that. His connection with his own childhood suffering has given him a sense of other people and their suffering. And then he's shown his sister. He's shown his sister who died as a young adult, and he re-experiences his fondness for his sister. So he gets, in his imagination, in his memory, he reconnects with positive emotion. And then he's shown himself again in his first job. So his first job, he's working with his close friend Dick. Back then he had close friends. And his very kind employer, who rejoices in the name of Mr. Fezziwig, because he wore what's described as a Welsh wig. I don't know what that is, but anyway. So Mr. Fezziwig, but Mr. Fezziwig was a really cracking employer, and he was really kind. And he remembers the kindness of his employer, his first employer, and all the things he did for him. And he feels this uprush of gratitude. And at this point, the ghost sort of mocks Scrooge's previous attitudes. He says words that Scrooge himself might have said. He says, it's no small matter to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. Just the sort of thing that Scrooge might have said from his position of sort of intellectual superiority at one time. It doesn't take much to make these silly folks feel grateful. But actually Scrooge is now not in his head anymore. He's actually experiencing gratitude. He's become aware of the benefits he's received. And then the ghost vanishes. There's a bit more to it, but the ghost vanishes. But the arising of some human sympathy for others who suffer as he had suffered, and the memory of the warm feelings he'd suppressed or forgotten about that he felt for his sister and those close to him and his friend Dick, and his gratitude for benefits received from his old employer, Mr. Fezziwig, have started to change. They've started to change in Scrooge. So when the next ghost appears, the ghost of Christmas Present, Scrooge is open to what it has to show him. He's receptive. And he says to that ghost, if you have anything to teach me, let me profit by it. So he's made a big step forward. And the ghost of Christmas Present basically shows Scrooge other people enjoying Christmas. Well, actually, he shows other people enjoying their warm, close relationships with others around them. He shows Scrooge the joy of positive emotion, the joy of relatedness, the joy of connectedness with others. He shows him especially people that Scrooge thinks he's better than. People Scrooge looks down on. And people he looks down on because he's rich and they're poor, or because he's got power over them, or because he thinks he's cleverer than they are. So he shows him his poor menu that he said bar humbug to when he invited him around for Christmas dinner. He shows him with his friends and his fiancée. And he shows him his poor, unprepossessing clerk, Bob Cratchit, who turns out to be not so poor after all, but to have a much richer life than Scrooge, because he's loved and he loves. So he shows him people enjoying the joy of positive emotions, the joy of positive relationships, the joy of connectedness, relatedness. Including people who he thinks he's better than. The hardest to take of all, he's shown how he looks in their eyes. So he hears their conversation. And he sees that other people, far from thinking that he is better than them, they feel sorry for him. They feel sorry for him. They feel sorry for him for the way he's cut off from human warmth and human relatedness, and from positive emotions like metta and joy. And that's true even of people he has power over, even of people who are poor, even of people who he thinks are stupid. So that's the ghost of Christmas Present. And then finally, in the last watches of the night, the third spirit appears to Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas yet to be. And this ghost shows Scrooge his own death. And the legacy he leaves behind him. So one of the things Scrooge sees is, well, he sees himself on his deathbed. And he sees the important businessmen who he thinks of are his peers, talking about the fact that he's going to die. These are the people whose respect he wants. He thinks he's one of them. He wants their respect. And he sees what they really think of him. So one of them says, it will be a very cheap funeral because nobody will go. And another one says, well, maybe I'll go if there's a free lunch. So he sees these rich and powerful people who he thinks of as his peers and what they really think of them, which is, he hasn't earned their respect at all. He sees that one of them says, well, I'm probably his best friend because I sometimes speak to him in the street. He sees he's got no friends at all, not a friend in the world. And there is nobody who regrets his death. He sees that people will steal his possessions, that people like the laundress and the charwoman who cleans his house will steal all the stuff that he values so much, and that nobody will stop them because nobody cares. He sees himself dying alone, miserable, and we're told that he thinks avarice, hard-dealing, griping cares, they have brought me to a rich end, truly. And he asks the Spirit, is there anyone who feels regret at my death? Is there anyone who feels any emotion at my death? And he's shown a couple who owe him money, and who are near to being thrown out of their house for not having it paid back. And he hears them say how glad they are that he's died, because they say that whoever the debt passes to couldn't be as hard-hearted as he is. And then he's shown the future after his death. Someone else is in his chair, in his office, and everything carries on exactly as it was. He might as well never have existed. The only sign of his life is an overgrown gravestone that nobody bothers to look after. And then, as the morning dawns, this ghost of Christmas future, Scrooge actually thinks he's been away for yonks, and he thinks he's dead. He thinks this is he's sort of entered into this, he thinks he's dead. He thinks he's died and he's being shown what's going on. So he's completely devastated. What a waste of a life. What a horrendous waste of a life. He's full of regret. He's totally devastated. Then morning dawns, and the ghost of Christmas yet to be morphs into his bedpost. Poof. And he realises he's not dead. He's not dead, and he hasn't squandered his opportunity. He's immensely relieved. He sees that he's had a reprieve. It's as though he's been given a second chance. He's given this amazing opportunity. He still has a chance to do something to change himself and to change his impact on the world. And he says, I'm light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I'm as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to the whole world. Hello there, whoop! Hello! That's apparently what Victorians said when they were really happy. He says, I don't know what day of the month it is. I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm a baby again. Never mind, I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Spiritual death. Spiritual rebirth. He's experienced a spiritual death and a spiritual rebirth as a result of his experience. The profound emotional change that's happened in him. So he sends a turkey to Bob Cratchit's house by taxi. A huge one, the biggest one he can get. He gives a large sum of money to the charity collectors, so big that they're shocked, and says, well, that's for all the years I didn't give. He goes to his nephew's house for Christmas dinner, and he's a thoroughly nice man, and he has a thoroughly good time. He's completely changed. He is reborn as a happy man, whereas he had been a thoroughly miserable man. Because he'd been focused on the wrong things, and he hadn't seen that it's all about positive emotion. So what Dickens said is he became a good friend, a good master. He's as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the old city knew. Some people laughed at him to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh and didn't heed them. For he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good at which some people didn't laugh. Cynicism's gone. He sees through cynicism. And knowing that such people would be blind anyway, it is quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grins as have the malady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite good enough for him, it says. So it's quite a transformation. It's quite a story, actually. It's quite a story. I remember being very affected by it when I read it first, and again, when I read it again recently, because there's something very true about it. And okay, it's exaggerated in his case. It's exaggerated. He goes from one extreme to another extreme. He goes from being totally miserable and self-centered and really thoroughly horrible to being this almost saintly character. But there's something about it which says something about all spiritual rebirths, actually, which we can experience. Our spiritual rebirth. All spiritual rebirths involve positive emotion. They all involve a shift in emphasis from a tight emphasis on ourselves and our wants and our resentments to connectedness with others, to concern for others. They all involve an emotional transformation based on that shift in emphasis. Okay, so nice story, but what does it tell us? What does it tell us about what we could do to have our own smaller spiritual rebirth and through positive emotion? What could be our less extreme version of the ghost of Jacob Marley and the ghost of Christmas past, present and future? So one thing to say is that although this was a profound emotional transformation that Scrooge experienced, it came about not through trying to sort of grind out emotions. It came about through increased awareness. So the ghost showed Scrooge aspects of reality. So he became aware of his own suffering. He saw himself suffering as a child. And then he became aware that others suffer just as he did. He became aware of the kindness that others had showed him. He felt gratitude. He became aware of the fact that other people experience very, very strong joyous emotions and relationships. He became aware of aspects of reality. He became aware that he was going to die. He became aware that he was a powerful agent, that he could have an impact on the world for good or bad, and that the impact he was having was for bad, but that he had a choice in the matter. He became aware of the law of karma. He became aware of the fact that he was creating himself, and that the person he was creating was not going to be much fun to be. So we could sort of learn maybe a bit from that. We could maybe learn a bit from that. So we could become aware of things from the past that evoke positive emotion. We might focus on gratitude. One of the things we do in the intermediate course, some of you have been on recently, is just sit down and spend a while writing a list of people people who have benefited from us, people who have benefited us. We call it the gratitude exercise. And actually, I don't know if some of you may not know this, but this week we're doing what we call an urban retreat, where some people are sort of really trying to up our practice. And on Sunday we sort of talked about what we're going to do. And I was with one group of people who said that all of them, every day, what they were going to do the gratitude exercise. Every day they were going to sit down and write down a list of people who benefited them. I don't know exactly whether it was for that day or whether it was for life, but I thought, what a cracking idea. What a cracking idea. And wouldn't we be more aware if we did that? So often we receive so much, but we're just not aware of it. We're just not aware of it. And the response to becoming aware of it is positive emotion. It's gratitude. It's breaking out of that sort of prison of just self-concern. We suddenly realise that we've been on the receiving end of loads of positivity, loads of positive effects, loads of benefits, as Scrooge did when he remembered his old employer. So that might not be a bad idea. Become aware of the past, focus on gratitude. Scrooge also became aware of the present, the ghost of Christmas present. So we could become aware of people in the present. We could connect imaginatively with people and cultivate empathy. How do we do that? The Metta Bhavana, the good old Metta Bhavana. Just simply thinking of other people, taking our mind out to other people, is an exercise in awareness, but which induces positive emotion. And we can use some of the things that the ghosts showed Scrooge. So one of the things the ghosts showed Scrooge was just to remember metta from the past. He remembered his metta for his sister. And if we remember it, we experience it. If we take our mind back, we will experience what we experienced then. And the ghost also sort of took Scrooge's mind out to other people. He became aware of other people. He entered their world. In a way, he exchanged places with them. So sometimes he saw what they thought of him, which was a very not very pleasant experience. And there's a whole practice within the Dharma of exchanging self for others, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, doing that imaginative exercise. So do the Metta Bhavana. That would be another thing we could do. The Metta Bhavana could be our version of part of Jacob Marley's Ghost and the Ghost of Christmas Past, Present and Future. Thirdly, we can become aware of the future. We can become aware of, if you like, reality. We're going to have a legacy. We will have an impact, for good or bad. What sort of legacy, what sort of impact do we want to have? How do we want to change the world? Because we will. What's the sort of impact we'd like to have? Using our imagination to connect with the fact that we will have an impact, what do we want it to be, can have a really profound effect on the way we live our life and connect us again to positive emotion. And we could be aware of the reality of the law of karma as well. The fact that it's not just about other people, it's also about us, actually. Acting on positive emotion is in our own benefit as well as benefiting other people. So there's a few things we could do. There's a few things we could do to sort of have our own version of the mega, our own little version of the mega experience that Scrooge experienced. I think actually I experienced a little bit of that when I first came along to the Dharma. When I first came along to the Dharma, I'd been trained as a scientist. I was almost uniquely rational in my approach. I learned the mindfulness of breathing. I thought it was wonderful. I learned the Metta Bhavana, and I thought, why would I want to bother to do that? I remember actually consciously thinking at one point that I felt very shut up in myself, and I remember consciously thinking, well, I don't owe anybody anything. Simple as that. I don't owe anybody anything. And I started doing the Metta Bhavana, and lo and behold, doing the Metta Bhavana was far more transformative than doing the mindfulness of breathing, which used to get me into dhyana. Something like dhyana. It was nice. Whereas the mindfulness of Metta Bhavana was, I've got to think about people. But we can have our own versions of this. We often are cut off from our positive emotions. So we need to cultivate that. And we can do it through learning some of the lessons that Scrooge was taught. Gratitude for the past, empathy, connection with people in the present, remembering the future, remembering we're going to have an impact and deciding what that's going to be and the sort of person we want to become. But if I had to focus on just one thing, I'd say do the Metta Bhavana. Do the Metta Bhavana. The Metta Bhavana, it certainly changed me. And it's just fundamental to what we're trying to do. It's very, very easy because some people find it more difficult than the mindfulness of breathing. The mindfulness of breathing is like, refreshing, etc. If we're using our mind a lot. But the Metta Bhavana can be far more transformative to us because it is giving rise to positive emotion and hopefully emotional transformation. Often people sort of give it a second place. Some people do, anyway, give it a second place. I'd really advise against that. If you're like me and you love the mindfulness sobriety, you don't like doing the Metta Bhavana, just give it a go. Alternate it with the other one. It really can have an impact, really big impact. And even if you're not interested in getting enlightened, it's got all sorts of other impacts, all sorts of other benefits. You don't even need to think about enlightenment. So there's a traditional list of things you get from doing the Metta Bhavana, and they include you sleep better. People like you. Demons don't bother you, which we could sort of translate as, well, you won't get as much anxiety and depression. You will live longer, and you'll be more attractive. So it's better than clothes, and it's better than cosmetics, okay? You can spend loads of money on clothes and cosmetics and still look. So, you know, if there was a product on the market that you could guarantee would make you sleep better, make people like you, make demons not bother you, make you immune to anxiety and depression, make you live longer and look more attractive, you'd pay loads of money for it. And you can get it here for nothing. So do it.